What's the most bone-chilling thing you've ever witnessed? Story 1. My father is a physician, has been in practice for 30 years, and has literally seen tens of thousands of patients. One day, a few years back, he goes to see a woman who had been admitted to the hospital the previous day for a serious lung condition. He enters her hospital room in the morning. The woman is heavily sedated, and there is a nurse fixing her bed and cleaning the room. Immediately upon entering, my father gets a severe allergic reaction, feels like he can barely breathe, and tears start rolling from his eyes. The nurse stands and helps him back into the hallway. After Dad finally recovers and apologizes to the nurse, he says, "That's so weird. That only happens when I get close to cats." The nurse goes white as a ghost. It turns out that the hospitalized woman had been awake all night, screaming that cats were crawling all over her body and trying to scratch out her eyes. The hospital staff believed she was simply having a strange reaction to some medication, and after hours of her terrified screaming, they were able to medicate her to sleep. There is probably a logical explanation for the whole situation, but I remember finding the account bone-chilling when I first heard the story. Story 2. Scariest moment. I was about 16 or so, and on my way to help decorate for a school dance. A buddy and I decided to go get some snacks and drinks for everyone, and he's driving his hatchback Camaro, 90s model. About halfway down the road while heading back with the snacks, we are coming around a fairly sharp right curve, and halfway through the curve a truck comes blasting toward us, half on our side of the road. My friend swerves and overcorrects a few times until we are heading semi-straight on the road, not realizing we are still sliding a bit toward the ditch. He tries to save it, and we hit the ditch on the driver's side, still moving fairly quickly. The last thing I remember before blacking out was us in midair careening into the ditch. The car was mangled and upside down, facing the opposite direction we were heading, and both of us are hanging upside down in our seats. He's still unconscious and his head is tilted sideways against the roof. I had to crawl through the broken window on the back hatch because the doors were crushed. There was a man standing across the road who just happened to live right across from where we crashed. He said we hit the ditch, flipped, and the top of the car was crushed on a tree before rolling back down into the ditch upside down. I had a mild concussion and he cracked a bone in his neck but wasn't paralyzed. We were lucky as hell. I still get nervous when riding as a passenger. Most bone-chilling. The day I had to use all the training in CPR I never imagined I'd ever need. Working at a grocery store, I heard a woman screaming about something in one of the aisles. Another woman came running toward the front, panicked and asking if anyone knew CPR, as some guy had collapsed and wasn't breathing. I closed my lane with people still in line and met a pharmacist who works there halfway to the guy. The two of us were the only ones who were trained in CPR, and we worked for about 30 minutes, switching out every few minutes when one of us got exhausted. A lady came back a few days later to the shop and told us she was a relative of his and that he didn't make it, but thanked us for trying so hard to keep him alive until the paramedics got there. I still remember it like it's fresh in my mind. Story 3. I work in mental health, particularly with people who have extensive suicidal ideation and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. Despite working with this population for close to 10 years, I have only had one client successfully take their own life. They poured gasoline over themselves and set themselves on fire. There are no words for how extremely terrifying that is to see. The worst part was they didn't immediately die. I will hear them say, "That wasn't what I wanted," for the rest of my life. Edit. All my clients live in their own apartments. The criteria for being accepted to my program is multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, but once they are on the team, we don't encourage hospitalization. It can definitely be a double-edged sword. Story 4. I never thought I would share this story with total strangers, but here goes. So my mother, sister, and I lived in a small apartment. An important thing to note is that my mother was a psychiatrist. She lost her license for attempting to harm a patient. So she had a very large collection of painkillers, psychedelics, and more. So it was my sister's 13th birthday party, and my mother decided to down an entire bottle of cough syrup, enough vodka to harm most people, and probably something else. It gets to be about 11 at night, and my sister started making plans for her and her friends to sleep in the living room. At this point, my mother starts trying to act inappropriately towards some of her friends and demands to sleep right next to them. My sister says no and gets slapped across the face so hard I could hear it clearly through my bedroom door. Next thing I know, my sister has grabbed the phone, telling me to call the cops and our father while she starts barricading my door with her body. "I will burn this whole house down if I have to," gets screamed at us as my mother breaks my door with a large knife in her hand. All I had time to do was tell the cops we needed police at our address before she points the knife at me and tells me to give her the phone. My sister then grabs the phone, screaming for help as my mother grabs her by the throat, picks her up and presses her against my window. Lucky for us, the police station was about a 5-minute walk from our home, so the cops were there after about 10 minutes of our little bedroom standoff. As soon as we saw the cop lights out the window, my mom dropped my sister and sealed herself off in her room. I have never been able to forget the look in her eyes as she pointed the knife at me. It still gives me nightmares years later. I would say we got a happy ending, but my dad was about the same as my mom, so my sister and I got split up, and we both ended up homeless. I found some very good friends I now call family who took me in, but my sister was not so lucky. I have not seen her in about a year now because her husband is abusing her, even though she says he is perfect. Story 5. I was on the jury for a trial where a 70-year-old drunk driver hit and killed a motorcyclist after making an illegal turn. Police testified against him. All the evidence was against him. It was pretty cut and dry. We go into deliberations after both parties rested, and one woman refuses to convict him on the most serious charge because he's old. She concedes on other charges and refuses to switch because she's doing us all a favor by convicting on the lesser charges. We sit there for hours trying to convince her. Then a fellow male juror switches to the other side because he wants to go home. Someone else gets hungry, so they give up as well. Other people switch. The jury can't come to a decision, and we can't convict him on the major crime. I won't forget seeing the wife of the motorcyclist cry, his parents in disbelief and starting to cry, his young daughter just sitting there quietly. Story 6. When I was around 8, I got on a roller coaster at Six Flags in Houston. It had those foam-covered bars that locked over your shoulders and a small seat to sit on, but your feet dangled. About a minute into the ride, it starts twisting. I slip halfway out of the seat and almost out of the seatbelt, which was supposed to be checked for security beforehand, but wasn't tight enough. I spent the entire ride digging my little nails into the foam, patting on the shoulder bars while the edge of the seat was digging into my back. My mom was sitting next to me and noticed what was happening. All she could reach was my shirt, and she held on to that for the entire ride. I haven't been on a coaster since. Story 7. Vet here, I used to work emergency shifts at night, and one time a lady phoned in saying her dog was bleeding from his nose. I advised them to come down immediately, although they didn't sound super distressed about it, just a bit concerned. I go to unlock the practice, and the car pulls up. The lady and her husband are there. The lady comes out of the car smiling and saying thank you for me coming out. She then goes around to the back where the dog was and lets out this soul-destroying scream when she opens the door. I ran over and all I could see was this poor spaniel in a sea of blood. Literally, the whole back of the car was covered in it. It turns out that a vessel in the dog's lungs had eroded, likely cancer-related, unknown that the dog was seriously ill prior to this, as it displayed no other signs of poor health aside from being a bit more lethargic. And it basically bled out through its respiratory tract on the drive over. The dog was already gone. I have never heard such tragic screams in my life, and it will haunt me for the rest of my days. I spent 2 hours with the poor family consoling them and reminiscing about their dog as he was in life. It was so sad. I have never been so disturbed by a single noise in my life as I was when the woman started shrieking. It was such a shock. Story 8. For the abusive person that he was, my dad did go through some traumatic things. Not sure how the conversation came about, but my mom ended up telling me this story. Back in 1992, a lot of people didn't care about seatbelt safety, and some even actively opposed it. Well, one young mother learned the hard way why wearing seatbelts is important. My dad drives a semi-truck as a cross-country delivery driver. He was cruising down the highway when all of a sudden, this car randomly swerves out of its lane into a head-on collision with my dad's truck. If you've ever seen the aftermath of a car-on semi-collision, you know how this is going to turn out. Miraculously, the mother lived. Her mother, the little girl's grandmother, died, perhaps from the impact or maybe from a heart attack. But the worst part was that the mother wasn't considerate enough to buckle up her 5-year-old daughter in the back of the car And upon impact, the little girl went flying through the windshield and didn't hit the ground for a solid 10 feet. She was gone on impact. And now that woman has to live for the rest of her life, knowing that one simple inaction is the reason her daughter is no longer here. Story 9. When I was about 12, my sibling broke down and told my mother that they had been touched by our grandfather. This was late at night, and me, my siblings, and my mom pretty much cried in a pile all night. It was one of the worst nights of my life. The next day we stayed home from school, but my mom still needed to go to work. No dad. We lived in an apartment that was semi-underground, and the windows on one side of the house were pretty much at ground level outside. We hear a knock, and my grandpa's voice asking us to let him in. We were terrified and ran to close all the blinds and lock the back door. He was an exceptional manipulator, and he put on his sweetest, saddest grandpa voice and started knocking on all the windows, pleading with us to let him in. None of us said anything, and we hid. We called our mom and whispered that Grandpa was here and trying to get inside the house. He tried opening the door, and when he found it locked, he started to get really angry. He quiet shouted how could we do this to him, and how he just loved us and nothing was wrong. He left after about 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mom rushed home as fast as she possibly could. I forget if it was the same day, the next day, or a while later, but his and my grandma's house was searched by cops. They found he had set up a tube to go from a closet in his study. He would never let anyone else go in his study, to the bathroom. And he had been watching us go to the bathroom and shower for I don't know how long. Good news is he did go to prison, a whole 3 years. We have to see him at family gatherings like funerals, and it makes my skin crawl. I've been mugged at gunpoint and almost kidnapped in Mexico by a gang fleeing America, 13 then. And my formerly sweet old grandpa trying to get at us kids for who knows what reason is the most terrified I've ever been in my life. Edit. I really appreciate the kind words towards me and the hateful words towards my grandfather. I'll answer some questions and tell more about the whole Mexico scenario. First, yes, we really do have to see him at family gatherings. We used to have a restraining order, but it has been a long time, and I don't think it still applies. I honestly don't know much about it since it was put on when I was so young. The types of gatherings were for a desperately sick relative or a funeral, so we really couldn't just ask him not to be there. We never talked to him, and he hasn't tried to talk to us, though we've never given him the chance. Second, my family is terrible. All but 4 family members sided with Grandpa. He seriously is a master manipulator and has had them in the palm of his hand for years. And they still hang out with him, have him for dinner, and spend Christmas with him. It truly makes me sick. Oh, and no, we were not pleased with 3 years. That was a slap in the face. He would be out while we were still kids, and it terrified us knowing he was out. Probably incredibly angry at us, and we still lived in the same place so he could easily find us. Mexico story. So a year later, when I was about 13, me and my siblings flew down to Mexico to stay with our Nana and Tata, Mexican grandparents, and there was nothing to do. It was summer in Mexico. What do? Play with the dust? So being bored, as I always was, I went to ask my dad, he lived there with Nana and Tata, if I could play outside, but he wasn't around. After searching and searching, no one was around. And when I finally found my Nana, she 100% ignored my question and got in the car and left to the market. So I'm like, okay, forget this. I give myself permission. How's that? And I get to walking down the super dusty dirt road. I'd been this way a million times, but I thought I would go about a block further than I'd been previously. And when I did, there was a cute little pond with a tight ring of trees around it. I was singing to myself about how angry I was that no one was listening to me and looking down at the ground. When I looked up, I saw about 12 serious-looking adult men just staring me down about 30 feet down the road. I was super creeped out, but I didn't want to look scared. And being an idiot 13-year-old, I just kept playing, pretending not to notice, because I didn't want to seem awkward and I was embarrassed to have been singing out my problems. I shy a look again and realize they're about 3 feet closer to me and still staring me down. No one is saying anything. It finally dawns on me this is no longer a safe situation, and I look at my options. I could run back down the dirt road, but it's about a mile back to the house, and they're definitely faster than me. Then I notice there's a huge vineyard field place on the other side of the road. It's totally full of dead, sharp plants, And when I actually see them walking faster toward me now, I make a mad dash for the field. Half of my brain is yelling, "Panic!" The other half is like, am I a huge awkward idiot for jumping into this super painful field? I hazard a look behind me and they are full out sprinting toward me. I prayed and ran as fast as I possibly could, jumping fences, dodging cattle, just hauling back to my Nana's place. She had a huge tree and I could see it from that far away. I didn't look back besides that one time, and when I got home, my Nana had just gotten back and she asked me what on earth happened. I explained that a dozen strange men were hanging out by the pond, and they came after me. She flipped, and this is not a woman who flips. She dragged me inside and told us not to go outside for the next few days. I heard her talking to my dad later that the gang fleeing America was still in town, and they tried to get me. And my dad told us again not to go outside, but everything was fine. They didn't call the cops because that would just make things worse. I had a million cuts on my legs, but that was better than whatever those people had planned. Story 10. 1996, age 19. I went on an interrail trip around Europe with my then boyfriend. Best trip ever, and cost peanuts compared to what I spend on holidays now with my two kids. Anyway, we were on the Greek island of Corfu. Some ferry routes fell under the interrail system, and hired little 50cc mopeds for a couple of days so we could see the island. It was nighttime, about 11:30 p.m. The sky was very dark due to clouds, and we were heading back to our hostel via a very steep, very bendy mountain road, which had cliff drops at the side. Scary enough, but then a truck comes tearing up around a blind bend at us, on the wrong side of the road. His lights were on full beam and dazzled me totally. I tried to pull over so he didn't hit me, but skidded and went straight off the cliff edge at about 30 miles per hour. I have a very strong memory of the sensation of flying and falling. While my heart beat so loudly in my ears it was deafening. I remember I held my breath the entire time this was happening, but my boyfriend said I was actually screaming at that point. Then it's as if I blacked out or fell asleep, because what seemed like centuries or eons later, I opened my eyes to see nothing but darkness, and could hear nothing. At least dying didn't hurt, I thought. Then instantly, oh, I'm still thinking. That's not what I expected. I thought everything would just stop. Maybe it will in a minute. Maybe this is it and I'm about to go. So I waited and waited. That was the scariest moment ever for me in my whole life. Just waiting to see what came next, knowing it was inevitable and I could do nothing to change it. Just then I heard distant yelling in another language and also noticed tiny specks of white light in the ceiling, sky above me. And then I realized I could see stars and streetlights by the shore, and the truck driver plus some other people were yelling in Greek. My boyfriend was screaming my name. I'm alive and I am hanging almost upside down, caught by my backpack straps in a tree which was growing out of the cliffside. It took a long time for them to get down and rescue me, and the moped shop was very upset about the loss of their moped. I have been on one since, but only briefly. My family has never been told this story, as they'd probably lock my now 40-year-old self up in the cellar, even now, just so I could never do anything that reckless again. Story 11. This happened a month ago when I picked up my sister from a party. I was driving home, and along the way I saw this black car doing 15 miles per hour, flashing brake lights, turning on the left indicator signal, but making a right. Impatient, I decided to illegally cut him off and just go home. But after I did it, he began to speed up and flash his fog lights, signaling me to pull over. I just kept driving, now creeped out. My house was a couple of miles away, with a lot of turns, but this guy kept tailgating me and pursuing me, which was getting pretty scary. I literally drove 50 miles in the radius of maybe 10 miles trying to get him off me. I finally made a left turn where he couldn't follow without risking hitting another car. I quickly pulled over and turned off all my lights, only to see the car slowly drive by as I held my breath, hoping he didn't spot me. After about 15 minutes, I looked around and slowly drove home. My sister was drunk and asleep, so she basically didn't even know what happened. Story 12. Scariest moment is when I had to come face to face with the scene where my brother took his own life. Growing up, I have always had trust issues, so whenever a relative passed away, I was like, meh, because I never allowed myself to become attached. However, this doesn't apply to my immediate family. They have my absolute trust and love. My brother took his life by drowning himself in the local lake, and when my family was notified, it had already been 4 to 5 hours. Yet when I arrived there, I was so scared and shaken up that I had to confirm several times that it wasn't a nightmare. Logic flew out the window as I proceeded to ask an officer, "What are the chances of my brother being alive?" Knowing that it had been hours since he jumped. I was 25 at the time too. I had to suck everything up and comfort my parents with false hope by saying, "This is probably not real." I will never forget that moment where all logic just flew out the window. Story 13. My group of friends liked to play this game we called Run. We would play late at night starting around 1 a.m. when the streets would be empty. Our town is very small. We'd walk down to Main Street and stand around outside the post office or grocery store. We'd hang out, talking and joking, until the local police officer drove by. We'd stand there just long enough for him to see us, and then we'd all scatter and run in different directions. The cop would chase us through town for the rest of the night. As long as we stopped, if he turned his lights or siren on, we wouldn't get in any trouble. We did this all the time, and the cops seemed to enjoy the sport. Sometimes they would even get out of the car and pursue us on foot. It was exhilarating and so much fun. Anyways, one night we were playing this game until around 4 a.m. The birds started singing and the sky began turning gray, so we decided to head home. As we were walking along a road parallel to the main highway, we heard this huge boom. We thought a bomb had gone off. We ran as fast as we could to where the sound had come from. We got to the local auto parts store and saw that a truck had plowed right into the side of it. There weren't any police or emergency services there yet, and this was before cell phones. So one of my friends sprinted off to the nearest house to call 911, while the rest of us cautiously approached the vehicle to see if the driver was okay. I can't even describe what we saw. It was like the bottom part of this guy stayed sitting in the driver's seat, but his top half had just sort of shifted over to the passenger side. He was in two pieces. I remember thinking how weird it seemed because it all looked so normal. I mean, not normal, obviously, but in movies, blood and gore seem a little surreal and stylized, and this was just, his mangled body was just sitting there. I'm not sure why it shocked me so much. It's not as if ominous music and mood lighting appear around every tragic scene in real life. A few seconds later, the tribal police from a casino 40 minutes away pulled up with their sirens blaring. A few minutes after that, the police, ambulances, and fire department arrived. Apparently, this guy had taken some money from the casino. The tribal police had been chasing him, but he ended up getting ahead of them. It had been raining, and there's a decent curve in the road by the auto parts store. And this guy had drifted over the curb and slammed sideways into the building. The really disturbing part was how the entire town came out to gawk at the accident. It took them hours to get the guy's body out of the vehicle. People were camped out on every lawn and sidewalk, trying to catch a glimpse. At one point, a few volunteers grabbed a bunch of sheets and tarps to hold up around the scene, and then people started going up on rooftops so they could see from above. This man had lost his life in a horrific and brutal way, and all people cared about was seeing his body. Story 14. I once witnessed the aftermath of a bar fight. One small drunk guy kept pushing a large sober guy for no apparent reason. The large guy knocked him out with one punch, but from what I heard, it was a vicious punch. I found the man lying between two pool tables. He had hit his head pretty badly when he fell back, and it was bleeding. He was completely out, wouldn't respond to any of my attempts to wake him up as we waited for the ambulance. The way he was breathing was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. His body was in survival mode just to keep his lungs pumping air. It was hard, forceful breathing. Blood was pouring from his mouth because several of his teeth had been knocked out. When EMS finally came and took him away, I couldn't even look at him any longer. Just to see someone in such a helpless state. The poor man even lost control of his bladder. I found out later he had to be life-flighted to a larger hospital because he had bleeding on the brain, but he apparently recovered and is still up to his old ways. I never want to see someone like that ever again. Story 15. During Katrina, I lived just outside Jackson, Mississippi. My grandmother and cousin who lived on the coast had come up to stay with us. We figured we'd be fine since no hurricane had ever done very much damage that far north. The storm had picked up pretty badly, and we were in the carport looking at the pine trees across the street bending. We kept saying how they were about to fall. We went back inside and I started listening to music on my CD player, pretty loud. Out of nowhere, I saw something pink and foamy fall from the ceiling and land on my cousin's face. She screamed louder than anyone I've ever heard before. I looked to my dad and saw him mouth, "Run." I got up, looked behind me, and saw a tree branch not 1 foot behind where my head had just been, sticking through the window. The giant oak tree in our backyard had fallen on our house. The only reason I'm alive is that the tree was forked and fell in just the right way to wedge itself on our chimney. Story 16. Snowboarding in Colorado, we were doing laps of the terrain park, and one of the jumps was getting a bit big for the landing. If you hit it too slow, you'd end up landing at the very bottom. My friend and I went over it and I landed on the flats. Flat area beyond the landing. When we were on the lift on the way up, maybe 10 meters away from the jump, I pointed it out and said we shouldn't hit that again because it wasn't safe. Not 5 seconds later, this skier comes flying down fast, hits the jump with good speed, clears the landing, clears the flats, and actually lands on the bottom of the next jump's kicker. For reference, this isn't small, maybe 10 to 15 meters or so kickers, 6 of them back to back. He literally lands on an almost perpendicular surface to his direction of movement. What followed was the loudest bone-crunching snap, clean snapped femur, and this sickening, deathly loud, blood-curdling scream. We watched from about 15 meters away, able to do absolutely nothing. By the time we got to the top, we notified ski patrol of the incident, and by the time we got to him, he was being helped by other terrain park enthusiasts, still screaming. Story 17. Scariest moment was probably when I almost fell asleep at the wheel as I was driving home from my ex's house. I'd pick her up from work on the weekend, and then we'd go out, but she usually had to be home around 2 to 3 a.m. This one night, I was already really tired because I had been up since 6 a.m., but I had to drive her home or she'd be in trouble with her parents. I was struggling to stay awake on the drive, 20 minutes each way, but she was still awake and would talk to me to keep me alert. After I dropped her off, she told me to drive safely and to pull off if I couldn't make it home, and to call her when I got home safely. I was about 10 minutes away from my house when it got to the point where I could only keep my eyes half open at best. I smacked myself in the face a few times to wake up and continued the drive home since I was so close. I was sitting there occasionally smacking myself while driving when I realized that I somehow ended up doing a really bad parallel parking job on the main street. I had no recollection of driving to the street. It was several blocks past where I normally turn to go home, or how I even managed to park the car. It honestly scared me badly because I was so fatigued that I basically drove on autopilot mode at 3 a.m. with no other cars on the road. I didn't remember anything after dropping off my ex. I decided right then and there to send her a quick text saying I was going to take a nap in my car. I didn't wake up until 9 a.m. the next morning, and the only reason I was up was the police officer who knocked on my window to check on me. Story 18. There was one time my sister and I were waiting for the bus when suddenly a man from the other side of the road started shouting at us. He was dirty, dressed in rags, and looked very unhinged and angry. There were cars passing by, but it didn't matter to him as he started dodging them, making his way toward us. Luckily, the bus arrived and we got inside as soon as the door opened. We told the driver to close it immediately, and then the man arrived, started banging on the door. The driver got the message and we left. The last thing we saw of him, he was still shouting and running after the bus. Everything happened so fast we were just in shock for a while. It was scary because we didn't know him, but for some reason, he just wanted to attack us. Story 19. When I was younger, me and the neighborhood boys were on a tree climbing kick. Big or small, we would get together and climb trees around the area. Well, when my mom found out about it, she forbade it and told me I was going to hurt myself doing it. Being a kid, I naturally ignored her, thinking if I was careful, I could never hurt myself. I remember one day, me and the boys got together and started climbing my friend's huge oak in his backyard. I had climbed it many times before, and it was my favorite because it overlooked his 2-story house. What made this day different was that it had rained only hours before, so the branches were wet. I had made it all the way to the top before turning to climb back down to my friends at the bottom when I lost my footing and fell. It all happened so fast, there was literally no time for me to be scared. I fell from the top of the tree, head first, and missed almost every branch on the way down until the very last branch, 6 feet away from the ground. My legs had buckled as I was falling, and I caught myself on the very last branch. Hanging there, upside down, staring at the ground below, I just thought to myself, holy crap, as all the adrenaline hit me. I am still convinced I would have died or broken my neck that day which I did break 3 years later. But that's another story. Story 20. Broke my neck in 6th grade gym class. It was the gymnastics unit, and I was doing a headstand while my friend held me for support. Since I was the chunkier kid, it was a lot of pressure on my neck already, but my friend thought it would be funny to push me during the already agonizing process. All my weight fell to my neck, and I heard 3 pops. When I got up, my neck was cranked all the way to the left and wasn't budging. Surprisingly enough, it didn't hurt badly, and I kind of stumbled around in confusion. My gym coach approached me and asked me to do a forward roll. I complained about my neck, but he was persistent. Thankfully, the female gym coach recognized something might not be right and told me to sit down. Class ended and the pain started. When I started crying in reading class, my teacher immediately sent me to the nurse, and an ambulance was called due to the severity of neck injuries. When I arrived at the hospital, the doctor ordered a CAT scan, and I was sent to a room afterward to await the results. I will never forget my mom breaking down crying when the doctor walked in somberly and told us I had a subluxation of my C1 and C2 vertebrae, a hairline fracture on my C1 vertebra, and almost all the ligaments in my neck were torn. When my mom started sobbing, I remember things suddenly felt so real. Surgery would be risky, and I had a chance of never walking again. Luckily, I had the best doctor in the world. He decided against surgery and instead put me into traction, where they screw large screws into my head while I'm awake and attach a weight to the back of it. The process lifts my head back into place, and I was in the hospital for a little under a week. Miraculously, I recovered rather quickly with little to no side effects. They had me in a brace for 6 months to heal the fracture and ligaments. Rehab was tough, but I can proudly say I have full movement in my neck 10 years later. The doctor said that if I had done that forward roll like the coach wanted, I would have been paralyzed for the rest of my life. Story 21. I can't say I was scared, but I was a bit freaked out. I went shopping at our small town strip mall. While I was in one store, I noticed a man walking past where I was browsing. I nodded a hello, smiled, and went back to shopping. After leaving that store, I needed to make a quick run to the supermarket that serves as the anchor store for the retail strip. As I approached my car after visiting the department store, I noticed the guy was sitting in a truck next to my car. Just a coincidence. No big deal. So I drove to the supermarket at the other end, went in, grabbed what I needed, and came back to the car. There he was again, parked right next to me. As I climbed up into my van, I saw the largest jar of Vaseline I believe I've ever seen, or ever will see. After my brain processed it, it didn't take long for my eyes to confirm. This man was smiling at me, fully exposed and engaging in an extremely inappropriate act. I calmly looked away, called my husband, who was working nights as a police officer, and told him the situation, the vehicle description, the man's appearance, and where we were parked. In less than 30 seconds, all 4 cops on duty, tiny town, showed up, including my husband. They sent me home and detained him. I was happy to be out of there. Until later, when I was told he was mentally challenged, apparently not so much that he couldn't get a license. His mother, who had been his only close human contact, had recently passed away. I understand now that he was acting out from grief, but sometimes I can't help but question the kind of dynamic that would lead him to act out in that manner. He wasn't charged with anything that night, but they did send him to a mental health facility for assessment, and that was the last I heard of him. As for bone chilling, I would have to say that I have many. I can't recount the hours I spent transcribing murderers' statements. 99% were just the typical types: women who harmed their cheating spouse, domestic violence incidents, and the like. But once I had to transcribe a recording of 2 young men begging for their lives while sitting in a dry tub, fully clothed, only to be ignored. And it continued to get worse. 6 teenagers and 2 men in their 20s, the ringleaders, mock the victims afterward, making fun of what happens to a body after death. They even recorded their plans to wrap the boys in barbed wire rugs with concrete blocks tied to their legs to sink them in a lake. Apparently, the cameraman turned off the camera when they began the transport. The recording resurfaced because the cameraman's girlfriend turned it in. Although I'm no longer a legal secretary, that case haunts me. The pleading and crying of those 2 young men, the mockery of their remains, it was too much. I quit my job the next week. Story 22. This actually happened to me recently. I posted it a few weeks ago in another thread and copied and pasted it, So I'm currently going through a nasty divorce. I left my wife about 4 months ago and moved into a house by myself close to work. We have a 4.5-year-old daughter whom I haven't been able to see for the last 4 months because my wife filed an injunction against me. Nothing happened. It was just divorce tactics. Luckily, she recently came to her senses and dropped the injunction, and now I have 50-50 timeshare with my daughter, which starts next weekend. Well, this past weekend, my mom came to town to help me set up the house because, I'm a guy, and guys have no sense of decor, right? At least that's how my mom thinks. And when it comes to me, she's right. We bought a twin bed for my daughter's room, bought her Frozen, her favorite movie, themed furniture and decor. We got a bunch of knickknacks to decorate the whole house, candles, pictures, fake plants, rugs, etc. We did everything we could to make it more homey. Before we bought all these new rugs and set up my daughter's room, I kept my cat's litter box in that room for the past 4 months while it was empty. After setting up her room, I moved the litter box to another empty bedroom. Well, my cat didn't like the fact that her box was moved. Apparently, she had decided that room was going to be her room and absolutely refused to use the litter box after it was moved. Instead, she would go on all the new carpets anytime my mom and I were out of the house. The entire weekend consisted of the two of us deep cleaning the new rugs with strong cleaning products every time she did it. Finally, I decided to put the litter box back in my daughter's room, which is right next to mine, until I could figure out a solution. Trust me, this is relevant. Fast forward to Monday, late afternoon. My mom's flight was at 6 p.m., so we left the house, went out for one last meal, and I dropped her off at the airport. I got home around 6:30 p.m. to my newly furnished and decorated house. It definitely made me feel more at home. I had no plans that night, so I spent most of the night on the couch binge-watching movies and drinking scotch. Around 11:30 p.m., I was pretty drunk and stumbled to my bedroom, closed the door, locked it because monsters and vampires, and collapsed on my bed. I passed out instantly. Around 4:30 a.m., I woke up to the worst smell I think has ever hit my nose. It was so bad it actually pulled me out of my drunken sleep. It smelled like a combination of filth, body odor, trash, and decay all mixed together. My first thought was that the cat went on the rug again. I ignored it, rolled over, and tried to go back to sleep but couldn't. The smell was that bad. Finally, I got up, unlocked the bedroom door, and peeked out into the living room to see if she left a surprise on the rug. Clean. I looked in my daughter's room, and there was a nice mess in her litter box. So the smell couldn't have been my cat, at least not what I was smelling. I shrugged it off, closed and locked my door, and collapsed on my bed. I laid on my bed staring into the darkness for about 30 minutes, trying to fathom what I was smelling. Maybe it was a combination of my cat's mess and all the cleaning product we used over the weekend? Maybe a pipe burst somewhere? Did I forget to take the trash to the curb and I was smelling all the junk we threw away over the weekend? No matter what conclusion I came up with, none of it made sense. A little after 5 a.m., I got up and walked to the bathroom and sat down to do my business. I browsed Reddit for a few minutes on my phone until I was done. I flushed the toilet, then collapsed onto my bed. You know that draining sound the toilet makes after you flush it? I'm laying there on my bed listening to the toilet do its drain cycle until it finally stopped and I was in complete silence. That's when I heard it, a sniff and the sound of someone clearing their throat from my closet. I don't know what happened, but I immediately jumped into survival mode. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, unlocked my bedroom door, grabbed my car keys and bolted out the front door and jumped in my car. I started the car and backed out of my driveway and into my neighbor's driveway across the street. I shined my high beams at my house while I called the police. They were there within minutes. The cops approached my car and I told them there was someone in my closet. I sleep in the nude, so the cops thought I was just some crazy drunk at first. But after 2 minutes of arguing, they went in to investigate. They were in there for what seemed like hours, and sure enough, they came out with a very skinny, clearly homeless man in handcuffs. They put the guy in the back of one of their cruisers and approached my car to ask me questions. Apparently, this guy snuck in through the back sliding glass door while I was dropping off my mom at the airport. He admitted to looking for pills or something to pawn for money when he heard me come home, freaked out, and jumped in my closet. The smell I was smelling was his terrible body odor coming from my closet just 3 feet away from me. This man was in my house the entire night, What if I hadn't smelled him and opened my closet the next morning while getting ready? What if I had my daughter over that night? The whole thought gives me shivers. Story 23. I don't know if this experience was bone-chilling, but it definitely is permanently seared into my memory. When I was in high school, I went to Colorado with some friends, and we decided to go climb a small mountain near the hotel we were staying at. The mountain was a very easy hike if you took the path, which was more of a deer trail. But being young and foolish, we decided to go up the hard way. This entailed hiking and scrambling along a 100 to 200-foot cliff for most of the way. We were having a blast and taking pictures along the edge when we spotted a precipice hanging out over the cliff. It overlooked this gorgeous valley between the mountain ranges. So naturally, we tried to climb our way down to it. We finally found the easiest path down, but there was a catch. In order to get there, you would have to jump down 6 to 7 feet and across a 4-foot gap with nothing but 200 feet of open air underneath you. No one was brave enough to do it, so I took a leap of faith, so to speak. I made it fine, and we got the picture, and now before me lay the task of climbing back up to my friends. Since I can't jump 6 feet into the air, I had to free climb my way back. All was going well until I ran out of foot and handholds. The next one was around the corner of the cliff above open air. As this was my only option, I reached for it. Luckily, I got a decent hold and then began the process of transferring the rest of my body around the corner. As I was about to swing my body around, my hand slipped, and the next thing I knew, I was falling. It was weird. It was like my mind went completely blank, and I had accepted my fate. Then miraculously, I landed on a tiny ledge about 2 by 1 foot, hanging out from the cliff face. I had fallen 15 feet and managed to stick the landing. I quickly climbed back up, and I didn't even realize what had happened until I reached the top of the cliff and sat there shaking. So yeah, fell off a cliff because I was being dumb. Story 24. Victim of a severe road rage incident. I am a small 26-year-old woman in a Mazda 3. At roughly 7 a.m. in the winter on Mountain County backroads, a giant Ford 350 decided I was going too slow. He started accelerating, first like he was going to ram me, then at the last moment passed me illegally on a turn. He got in front of me and then slammed on his brakes. I slammed on mine and narrowly missed hitting him. We were sitting there for a minute when he started revving his engine. He went into reverse and tried hitting my car. I screamed and went into reverse. We were now both driving down the mountain in reverse. I used my Bluetooth to call 911. They couldn't make anything out, I was saying, because I was screaming. After about 100 yards of driving backward, he stopped. I stopped. I don't know why. I started talking to the 911 operator. The man got out of his truck with a weapon and started running toward me. I screamed again. In the distance, a car was coming, and the man ran back into his truck and fled. I have never in my life been so scared. Never have I ever thought I was about to be seriously harmed. It's not a feeling you can forget, but it's hard to explain. I was crying and shaking uncontrollably for the next 6 hours. I do not drive that road anymore. Story 25. I was volunteering at a race and was in the middle of handing cups of Gatorade to thousands of exhausted runners who had just finished and were all shuffling past me. I was facing them to give them the little cups, so I was looking back down the race course at the finish line about 50 feet from me. Massive boom suddenly, and I saw this huge puff of smoke. Everybody jumped. It was loud. Everybody turned and looked. All the hundreds of faces that a second ago had been facing me were now swiveled the other way. The puff of smoke went rolling up the side of a church. Very eerie second of silence as everyone watched the smoke. And there was this weird, distant, high-pitched sound. Everyone's thinking, could that possibly have been a... Then suddenly, boom, a second one, bomb? And then the weird, distant sound resolved into a wave of distant screams. Blood-curdling, desperate screams. The screams took a couple of seconds to hit peak volume. They ramped up, and there was a tone to them. A pitch and raggedness of sheer terror that tripped some seriously weird alarm bells in my head. Every single one of those exhausted runners, who had barely been able to walk seconds before, just launched forward, almost levitating, and went sprinting past me. The look of that entire crowd launching into motion in synchrony, all those hundreds of faces whipping toward me again, and every single person pushing off into a sprint. I will never forget that. The volunteers around me ran too. Everyone ran except me and another volunteer, except the cops. The officers who had been standing nearby chit-chatting instinctively and instantly ran toward the booms. I have never seen a huge crowd flee in panic before, let alone one that had been so exhausted moments earlier. And I have never seen law enforcement sprint toward danger in real time. A second later, a wheelchair came bolting toward us, with a cluster of people around it and a white-faced volunteer pushing it. There was a man in it who I thought was sitting with his legs folded under him, and he was holding two red sticks out in front of him. He went all the way past me before I realized the two red sticks were his tibias. He wasn't sitting with his legs folded under him. His legs had been blasted off. He was the first of 26 people to lose legs, followed by hundreds of others with serious injuries. This was 4 years ago in Boston, in Story 26. This is a bit different, probably the most scared I've ever been, and the closest I've come to death. I was by myself, riding a motorcycle in a spirited fashion on a remote, forested mountain road that's famous among motorcycle riders. I came around a blind but high-speed corner at about 70 miles per hour. Suddenly, I found myself confronted with a herd of about 20 elk crossing in front of me. I literally couldn't see the road on the other side of the herd. I'm talking a solid wall of 600-plus-pound animals that are over 6 feet tall. I had enough time to close my eyes, and that's about it. At that speed, it would take over 200 feet to stop, and I had about 20 feet with no clear line through. Somehow, and I'll never know how, I got through totally unscathed. I remember hearing their hooves on the pavement. I pulled over and looked back to see the last of them running into the woods. I turned off my bike, got off, and sat on the side of the road for about 30 minutes until I mostly stopped shaking. Then I rode home very slowly. I haven't ridden that road since, or without a helmet camera. Edit. Interesting contrast in the comments. To clarify, these were moving animals. I was riding by myself, but this was not a deserted road. A guy in a car was about 5 seconds ahead of me. The car 10 seconds behind me probably didn't even see them. He only slowed down because he saw I was stopped. I would guess 2 to 3 vehicles go around this corner per minute, and none of them slow down. Had I been there 5 seconds earlier or 10 seconds later, I wouldn't have even known they were there. I have never seen or even heard of elk being in the area, though it is within their range. Edit 2. For context, I've ridden about 500,000 miles and have gone down 3 times. Twice on the track. Totally my fault, though for one, I suspect my rear tire lost pressure. The other time was when a driver pulled out in front of me and I couldn't swerve around because of oncoming traffic. I made eye contact with her and even let off on the throttle a bit, but she suddenly decided to go. Somehow she looked right through my bright red bike and white helmet. I've avoided other cars dozens of times. Story 27. Witnessed. This affected me so deeply that I can't even remember how old I was. I know I was in elementary school and it was before grade 4. I have more memories from pre-K than I do from between K to 4. This is the most vivid one. I woke up to my mother screaming hysterically. I walked out of my bedroom to see what was going on, only to see her collapse on the floor holding my infant brother. He had passed from SIDS sometime during the night. My dad got my other brother up, tossed us both into the car, and my mom got in, alternating between sobbing and attempting CPR as my dad raced us to the nearest fire station. When I was pregnant with my third child, I was so terrified that it would be a boy and would pass just like my brother that I became severely depressed. I wanted to be gone rather than face the death of my child, which I was absolutely convinced would happen if it were a boy, because my children had, to that point, followed my mother's experience. First child, a girl. Second child, 3 years and 1 month later, a boy. I was referred to a counselor, and I had my first visit with them a few hours before my anatomy scan, the one where you can see what your baby's going to be if you did not for the blood test. Third child, a boy. For the rest of my pregnancy, I refused to buy anything but his bed. We bought diapers on the way home from the hospital. I had to stop breastfeeding to go on a stronger antidepressant. I was on a cocktail of meds that didn't help much. They kept me from acting on my thoughts, but didn't do much else. I was afraid to get attached to him. I had difficulty playing with him. I was convinced he hated me, despite him being so attached that no one but me could hold him, or he'd scream hysterically. The only memory I have of my second brother being alive was Christmas, so I convinced myself that if my son lived past Christmas, I could stop worrying. After Christmas, I went off my medication completely. Things got a little better, but not entirely. He just had his first birthday a couple of weeks ago. Things are much better now. I'm no longer afraid to get attached to him. I still have panic attacks when we drive past fire stations, though. Story 28. I was 19 and working in a farm supply store. We had truckers who regularly came in to load up, and we knew most of them pretty well. There was one guy who was always a little off, shady and inappropriate. One day he came into the store and I happened to be alone because there was a crisis in one of the grain mills. I heard the bell jingle when someone entered, and I turned to go to the front desk. Instead, I saw him walking down the aisle toward me. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I knew what he was thinking and what he was intending. I've never before or since known so clearly what someone was planning. I was trapped on three sides, and he outweighed me by at least 100 to 150 pounds and had 6 inches on me. When he was about 8 feet from me, the face of our young, very fit, and large manager popped up over his shoulder from across the room. He yelled the man's name once, just once. I knew instantly that the manager knew what was happening. I'm guessing it was the look on my face or something he already knew about the guy. The man turned and faced in his direction, and the manager told him he would help him. The manager met him halfway across the store and escorted him to the door. I don't know what he said, but the guy, who had been a regular forever, never came back. The manager looked at me to see if I was okay, told me the man was no longer welcome, and we both went back to work. It was scary and so odd. I knew that everyone knew what was happening with no words. It was silent and terrifying. Story 29. I was once at a Carl's Jr. near the border between Mexico and the U.S. at around 2 to 3 in the morning. I was sitting by myself at a table, and it was very crowded. As I was sitting there eating, 2 guys sat down across from me. I didn't pay attention since I assumed they were just looking for a place to sit, but the guy closest to me, a rather chubby, bald guy with tattoos on his arms and neck, leaned in and said something along the lines of, "What's up, man? You should have never come here. I could have you tied up in my trunk and no one would know. What's stopping me?" I remember the feeling of sheer terror in my gut when I heard him say that. I knew that if I acted scared or lost my composure, something bad could happen. That's when I looked up and noticed the Nueva Generación among the tattoos on his neck. I tried to think of what to say for what felt like an eternity, and finally all I could say was, "You might regret it." That's when he and his friend chuckled and walked out of the restaurant. I know now they were probably just trying to mess with me and got the laugh they wanted, but that was one of the most frightening moments of my life, and I haven't gone near the border since. Story 30. This happened when I was 7, and it was probably the first time I was sure I was going to die. My family and I went on a massive road trip back to my mom's hometown, which was a small fishing village that thrived on tourism during the summer. It's a gorgeous place by the ocean, with views that belong in a fantasy novel, but the ocean is enormously cold and dangerous. We went on a whale-watching trip early in the morning and ended up getting caught in a massive ocean storm. The captain had been on the sea for years, but even he couldn't guarantee we'd get back to shore. It was terrifying. I was shaking constantly. My dad took the time to explain what death was and how it wasn't something we could fight if it was unavoidable. I grew up an atheist, so there was no solace in heaven. Thinking about it makes me anxious. It took us hours to get back, all the while bobbing in and out of the water. The real chilling part for me, as an adult, is that I was with my entire family. My grandmother, cousins, uncles, aunts, parents, even my dog and best friend at the time. We could have died, and an entire family basically wiped off the face of the earth. Story 31. I work in a healthcare type setting. A client of mine has seizures, and their tongue will bleed, and their eyes look like they will pop out of their skull. The first time I witnessed it, I was called over to help and had to keep them turned to the side so they wouldn't choke on their blood and support them from falling out of or tipping their wheelchair. I looked into their eyes while I was playing with their hair to try to help them relax. Watching another person's pupils dilate until all you see is black and their eyes go bloodshot is terrifying. They would also stop breathing during certain parts of the seizure. The whole thing was absolutely terrifying and had me on the verge of tears. A coworker, a client was choking, and they couldn't get them to cough it back up. They called an ambulance and had to try to create an airway for them to breathe. They bled everywhere, and the responders were not able to save them. The person passed away on the floor in front of them and other staff members. I'm trying to be as vague as I can be, such as not revealing genders or anything that would point toward that specific person, just in case a family member happens to be part of Reddit. One not related to my job. Long story short, an old roommate caused our house to be raided. Gun in my face and all. Found out he was downloading illegal content. At first we were in denial, thinking maybe it was a girl who looked of age and it had been a mistake. Then I called the detective. He told me the actual ages, and I lost it. It was terrifying to realize someone you live with could do something like that down the hall from you. It ruined my desire to have children and made it hard to go out in public for a good month. Story 32. Years ago, I lived next door to a very reclusive, alcoholic, middle-aged father and his young adult son. They shared a basement studio apartment in a very old building with paper-thin walls. Not that it mattered since they were up until ungodly hours screaming at each other in Korean and throwing things at the walls. But heaven forbid I make any noise at all in my apartment, closing a kitchen cabinet or turning on the sink. Then they were banging on my walls, screaming at me, and sometimes opening their door and yelling down the hallway at mine. It was impossible to deal with. I already had anxiety, and this made it so much worse. One day I got a package in the mail. Apparently it was delivered early in the morning in front of my door. I suppose the package was in their way, maybe. It wasn't big, but something about it made the guy snap. I woke up sometime later to hysterical howling and a much louder banging noise like cracking wood, and it was coming from the inside of my apartment. I ran into my living room in my pajamas, still half asleep, to see my front door barely hanging onto splinters of the frame. The neighbor was using all his strength to try to kick my front door down, throwing his whole body weight into it. I watched the cracks in the frame slowly travel down its length. I was terrified. As a 5'1", 20-year-old girl home alone with no weapons and no way to defend myself. Honestly, I thought if he broke in, he was going to seriously harm me. Then he backed off and entered his apartment as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day crying in my closet on the phone with my then boyfriend. I moved out of there pretty quickly after that. Story 33. I was scuba diving off a derelict oil rig near the Florida coast. We were under about 60 feet of water, and it starts to get pretty dark down there. If you look up, it's a rich cerulean, and looking down, it's pure inky blue. I couldn't see where the legs of the rig ended as they sank into the depths, but my brain imagined that they continued forever. My dive buddy started dropping pebbles and shells that he'd collected from the shore, and after a few minutes, these huge shadows started to appear from below. The disembodied head of a sunfish, it's not just a head, but they look that way, and a pair of oarfish were among them. I don't know if you've ever seen either of those things, but the sunfish was as tall as I am, 5 feet 9 inches, and the oarfish were at least twice that. The sunfish has a face like something out of a surreal cartoon and swims right up to me to gape its maw in my general direction. The fins from the oarfish kept brushing against my legs, and it was an odd feeling through my wetsuit. I took note of the adrenaline as I started to feel hot against the chill of the water. My partner grabbed me by the BC and thrust my computer into my face to point out that I was sucking down air like it was my job. The fish were just curious, but they're so foreign, and you're covered in gear, and the water is squeezing your whole body like a tube of toothpaste. I got my master diver certification that day. Story 34. Get ready for the most bone-chilling moment of my life. When I was younger, 13, 14, some friends and I were out drinking beers in a local park field. It's a pretty big place with lots of wooded areas and overgrown spots. Anyway, it gets to around 11:30, and we'd run out of beer, so we decided to head home. It was autumn, so really dark, and this park at night could be quite creepy, especially given some of the things that had happened there, including but not limited to violent incidents and muggings. We kept hearing voices in the distance, but never in any particular direction. As we got further through the park, we heard the voices quite loudly and clearly on the other side of a relatively overgrown clearing. There was a small campfire on the other side, and we could see 2 caravans and trucks parked up. The park was a popular place for travelers to rest for a while. I don't remember exactly what they were saying, but I remember us all being unnerved by the situation. So being the clever kids we were, we decided to cut through one of the wooded areas to go around the clearing, which was between us and the park exit. As we were going through the trees, snapping twigs and being loud, we noticed the voices had stopped. There was silence as we all stopped walking. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. All of us were just frozen in place. Were we about to be attacked by strangers?